Some analysis on that story. Peter Zalmayev is the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. It's an international NGO dedicated to the promotion of democracy and human rights in post-communist transitional societies. He joins us from Kiev. Peter, really appreciate your time. Now, are you surprised at what we've seen happen in Russia in the last few hours? I mean, this back and forth of accusations between doctors and Navalny's family, all while he's fighting for his life.
I would only be surprised if the official version of the story would be corroborated, and that is that he accidentally poisoned himself, having nothing to do with his many-year activity discovering massive corrupt schemes on the part of both Moscow and central government officials and local government officials. He was on his way from Tomsk, which is a regional hub, and was investigating corruption on the part of local officials there, which tells you that Russia remains, if it's the case that he was poisoned, it remains that it will prove that Russia remains a lawless, mafia-ridden state. The only question that I would have at this point is if this was ordered by the central government in Moscow or by local officials that he was investigating.
Well, you describe, Russia as a mafia state, and it isn't the first time we're hearing about these alleged poisonings of Russians and critics. We think of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia and former KGB agent Alexander Litvinenko. I mean, the Kremlin denying, of course, any involvement in these incidents, but surely this all can't be a coincidence, and certainly not this type of method of poisoning. How do ordinary Russians view all of this? I mean, do they see it in a critical light, or is it just something that's the norm in the country?
I'm afraid you're correct. This kind of behavior has been normalized, and people are at this point very cynical. I mean, one thing, we have these defectors that you mentioned, Mr. Litvinenko and Mr. Skripal, who were part of the system. They were KGB agents, and so this is the case where KGB cadres are dealing with whom they view as traitors. A few years ago, let me remind you, a major opposition leader, Boris Nemtsov, was murdered smack in the middle of Moscow next to the Kremlin. I mean, at that point, I think the country becomes sensitized to where any subsequent murder like this is considered just par for the course, business as usual. What is remarkable about Mr. Navalny is he actually has been able to stay alive all these years, working right under Kremlin's nose and publishing his exposés on YouTube, which were viewed by millions and millions of people. The only surprise I have is that he has remained alive and he was not either poisoned or murdered otherwise earlier.
Local elections in Russia are being held next month. We know Navalny had been campaigning. He's a tough critic of Putin, as you've said, but does the Russian president view Navalny as a real challenge to his leadership?
Per se, probably not, but and that's why he's been tolerated all these years, including the fact that he wasn't always going after Putin. Some of his targets may have been enemies of the Kremlin itself. So there may have been situations where what he was doing did not really matter to Kremlin or even played it into its hands situationally. At this point, though, when you have Belarus to the west of Moscow that is up in arms, and there's a popular uprising against Russia's vassal, Mr. Lukashenko, and then you have protests, massive protests, raging for weeks in the far east of Russia, in the city of Khabarovsk. Navalny's voice, who's always talking about these protests to his millions of viewers on YouTube, becomes all of a sudden much less comfortable. And, Putin's calculation may have changed at this point, but once again, it's too early to speculate. You cannot discount the possibility that it was local Tomsk officials who may have been involved.
Peter Zalmayev, always great to get your input on this live to us there from Ukraine. Thank you for that. I'm just going to stay on these live pictures, and these are coming from the German capital, Berlin. We know that Alexei Navalny has arrived in the capital. this is the hospital where he is being transported to. It's expected he will be treated here. The hospital is known as Charité Hospital. It's the same place that treated another anti-Kremlin activist 2 years ago. He was allegedly poisoned in Moscow. Strong security, as you can see, at that hospital as they await the arrival of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Just a reminder that on Thursday he fell ill after a suspected poisoning. His drink was spiked while he was on his way to Moscow. He was then treated in a Siberian hospital, and he was allowed to leave on Friday after his family demanded that he be allowed to go to Berlin for treatment. We'll bring you more details once he arrives at that hospital in Berlin.